As the title of the talk suggests, I will be speaking today about the ethics of AI and about how we might action the various universal principles that have been proposed in diverse venues and sources, from academic research to government reports and recommendations in concrete domains of applications. So also, as the title suggests, I will use the example of AI in education in particular, which is my area of specialization, to illustrate how such actioning may be undertaken and what further questions arise when we try to make ethics of AI concrete in the way that we design and deploy AI technologies at the front line of human activity. And of course, AI and the ethics of AI in particular are very important topics to consider in the context of education, not least because AI is increasingly hailed as a new powerful technology that can affect our lives, that can help us live, think, and work. And as I already said, there are many reports and government guidelines that highlight and discuss the ambitions for AI as a technology that can help us understand complex environments, can help us make better decisions, make us more efficient and more productive, whatever that means. And at the same time, there are also increasing concerns which are raised about how AI can impact in a negative way many aspects of the way in which we work and live, and often also how it can impact negatively or reinforce and proliferate pre-existing social inequalities and biases. So identifying these different issues and concerns and addressing those issues and also understanding why they arise has become increasingly a very pressing question because AI is being already used across different contexts of everyday lives, from seemingly low stakes contexts, such as the film choices we make on Netflix, to news we read, all the way to the high stakes applications of AI, such as in medicine and financial decision-making, as well as law enforcement. And obviously, the higher the stakes, the more profoundly we can be affected by these technologies at the individual and at the societal level. There are, of course, questions also around, whether what we consider low stakes indeed are low stakes, because there are questions around, how our cultural values, for example, are being habituated in particular ways, which may not be desirable. So it's really important to pose these questions and to start identifying the issues and start identifying the ways in which we may begin to address them. And just so to give you a couple of examples, very prominent examples, you, I'm sure, likely familiar with these examples. It's nevertheless useful to go back to them. This is one example from AI being used to help in law enforcement, specifically in the United States, in helping judges estimate risk of recidivism. So this was a system called Compass, which was used to basically help judges make those decisions. And it was a very prominent case back in 2017 when ProPublica published quite shocking tendencies in terms of the system actually proliferating racial biases in this decision-making process. So this is an example of two defendants, one white, one black, with an estimation by the system, lower estimation for the white defendant and higher risk estimation for the Black defendant, regardless of the fact that actually when we look at their specific profiles, actually the profiles themselves are not comparable in terms of the risk, and actually the risk assessment should have been reversed. But the data that these decisions have been made has been encoding historical racial biases. Another prominent example from Google picture classification, I think that was back in 2015 or 2016 when the classification system failed to recognize people of color, classifying them as gorillas, despite the fact that all the other images have been classified correctly. So this kind of leads to issues of harm, in this particular case of harm of denigration, which and obviously inequality as well, which illustrates the kind of amplification that the various AI systems and technology more broadly may introduce in our daily activities, and that may actually reinforce the pre-existent issues that we are already harboring within our social and cultural systems and infrastructures and values. So it is very important to consider how we design these technologies from the ground up, and how we can not only mitigate against the risks, but how we can also rethink the way that we design the technology so that we can address and prevent these issues from and associated harms from arising right from the beginning, right at the point of not even design, but even pre-design, considering the first kind of conceptual level in the way that we conceive of technologies. So in the past about 10-15 years, there has been quite a lot of activity within research and increasingly in policy to kind of generate effort around understanding how technology can actually affect us and our kind of social structures in negative ways. And of course, these questions are linked very much across the various contexts. These are not just technological or technology-focused questions. They extend to different layers of our lives, from the way that we govern ourselves and the way that we establish and evaluate and extend our moral values. And as a consequence of this work, there are many ethical dimensions that have been proposed. So this is not a comprehensive list. This is not a list that relates specifically to any particular work. It's a collection for illustrative purposes of the kind of concepts or ethical concepts and dimensions that people do consider when they talk about ethics of AI, and when they consider how we may design ethical AI. So people talk about equity and equality, justice, explainability, privacy, transparency, inclusion, trustworthiness, and fairness. And these dimensions are kind of fit depending on the specific focus of individual researchers and the specific kind of prerogatives of any kind of policy effort. They kind of fit into specific frameworks, or certain dimensions are emphasized over others. Having said this, in the past about 5 or so years, there has been actually quite a lot of effort to systematize and to develop a form of taxonomy to kind of make our understanding of these dimensions and how they bear on one another and how they may bear on the designs of the technologies a bit better. And as a consequence of this, and again, these efforts are ongoing, and it's a very dynamic area. It's actually really hard to keep up with the developments, especially because a lot of people have all of a sudden become expert ethicists and experts in AI. So that's kind of an interesting development as well. Everybody wants to have a stake in this, which is good, and it can be also bad because there's a lot of noise out there. But having said this, there are some really interesting and very helpful approaches to trying to systematize these dimensions, and they are driven mainly by the needs of the policy makers and various kind of governmental bodies across the world to start putting in place governance and auditing structures for and mechanisms for AI. And so a lot of the efforts that that result from these various a lot of these efforts result in very high level prerogatives, if you like, ethical prerogatives. And this is one example which is quite prominent. I think it made more or less in this form into the EU guidelines on trustworthy AI and ethics of AI. And these dimensions, essentially, you could fit any one of those lower level dimensions that are depicted here in gray under one of those higher level dimensions that you can see here. So one of them is non-maleficence, which essentially relates to doing no harm, and so developing principles and auditing mechanisms for inspecting the technology with respect to any kind of harmful potential consequences of those technologies at different levels. Beneficence, which relates to doing good, so actively actually designing technologies to do good. Justice, which relates to fairness. Mainly autonomy, which focuses on the preservation of human autonomy and balancing between AI autonomy as a special case, obviously, of technology, which is agentive and is purposely agentive in the human context and is purposefully designed to affect and interact with the human. So that's a really important and quite difficult question to address. And explicability, which essentially, at least in this particular account by Floridian Curls, is divided into further two subdomains of transparency, so systems' ability to show and explain the operation of the system to the users, and accountability, which relates to the question of who should take responsibility for the operation of the system. And none of these questions are actually trivial in themselves, but at least having this kind of structure allows us to then engage in a more systematic way in questioning, or interrogating these questions in a systematic way. So moving on from this, so we have these high-level dimensions, but there has been also a lot of work done in the field, which has identified bias as a source of, or as the main source of ethical issues in AI. And a bias essentially refers to some form of inequality between things or people, which lead to diverse forms of harms, discrimination, and prejudice. And as I will explain in a moment, most of the work within AI focuses on algorithmic bias and data bias, but it's worth reminding ourselves, and it's really important, and I think also of relevance to the conference, that none of these questions that we have around harms and prejudices and biases exist independently from one another. So at a very high level, so there are a number of different biases which impact on one another. And at a high level of description, there are at least three types of biases, as you can see here: moral bias, legal bias, and statistical bias, which is really important to, all of which are really important to take into account when considering the questions around ethics of AI, and especially if we are diving into the questions around the bias that is encoded in AI technologies and the data that it consumes. So moral bias refers to a domain of philosophical inquiry mainly, which is deeply embedded in cultural and social norms at any given time. So these social and moral norms actually are subject to change. So understanding moral principles is really important, but as with anything in this field of ethics, it is also not trivial, because morality is, as I said, subject to continuous changes through history and is deeply rooted in the specific social, cultural, and religious environments. At a very general level, moral bias can be appraised with respect to rather fuzzy notions of good and bad. So this kind of refers to these high-level dimensions by Floridi and Cowles of beneficence and non-maleficence, for example. So this is the first kind of level that we need to be aware of when we talk about the bias. One way in which moral bias manifests itself in the application of AI is in reinforcing systematic and historical discrimination and stereotypes that violate some moral ideals of equality. And these stereotypes can be related to any number of things, from race to gender stereotypes, and sexuality and so on. And these can be visible through different behaviors, which don't always have to be used in malicious ways. They may simply be ingrained in the ancient historic habits of particular social groups or particular cultures. Examples of such habits are apparent, for example, in the use of gendered language models, which we use on a daily basis, but and we take them for granted, but they do actually can represent quite biased ways that reflect our historical habits. So one example would be from Google Translate, which translates from languages, gendered languages, to where you have gendered nouns, to languages like English, to languages that are non-gendered, and vice versa, where like Turkish, for example, where you can have an assignation or assignment of particular social roles like doctor and nurse automatically being done with respect to men and women, respectively. Next is the legal bias. This is a domain of justice and governance. So let's put this here. it's basically focusing on sticking to the letter of the law. And since law is normative in nature, the main prerogative in many legal processes is impartiality and avoidance of prejudice. And if these prerogatives are violated, then they will lead to undue prejudices. Legal bias is closely related to moral bias, since, of course, law tends to follow moral norms, albeit at a very slow pace. And examples of legal bias include employment discrimination, for example, based on gender, race, or disability, again, due to social and historic habits, and increasingly due to data that informs the decisions of lawmakers, like we have seen, for example, in the context of the Compass example that I have shown earlier. And technology, including AI, that encodes such prejudices will lead to morally and legally questionable decisions and judgments, again, as we have seen in the context of predicting recidivism. And then finally, we have the statistical bias, which refers to flaws in data or in the data collection process, including the way that we run experiments or design the experiments. And this can lead to generating results that do not represent accurately the population at large. So statistical bias relates to largely to domain of science and technology, where data constitutes a basis for predictions, models, and decisions. At a very general level, statistical bias can be said to result from statistical under or over-representation of certain populations. So this is a very kind of general description of what we're looking at, and we will see that actually later on when we talk about data bias, more specifically in the context of AI. A prominent example of underrepresentation includes reliance on for example, labeled faces in the wild data set, which has been used notoriously for training and benchmarking image recognition systems, and where there is actually still, I believe, a paucity of data that represents diverse color skins and facial features. An example of overrepresentation includes an overestimation of particular tendencies in specific groups, as we have seen again in this infamous example of Compass algorithm, which overestimated the risk of recidivism for Black defendants and underestimated it for white defendants. And since statistical bias is often equated with algorithmic bias, which in the context of AI and data is understood as consisting of flaws in statistical representation, we will be focusing in the rest of the talk mostly on this form of bias. However, one thing that is important to note, and this is the reason why I have spent so much time on this particular on talking about these different biases, is that by looking at these different forms of biases at this high level also highlights the dependencies between the different domains and the complexity of those dependencies, in that the different types of bias do not always align with one another. And so addressing one type of bias may actually not render a system ethically better. So for example, it is possible for data collection to be statistically unbiased and to generalize well to new data. But if the data collection takes place in the context where there is historical bias, this training data could lead to biased decisions in the legal and moral sense, because the structural inequalities are encoded in to those data. And also an algorithm may not be statistically or legally biased, but it may be morally deviant insofar as it reproduces structural inequalities or reinforces stereotypes that violate common ideals of equality. And again, one example is that of gendered language models that I have mentioned earlier, that accurately reflect how language is used in society, but that also reinforces gender stereotypes that are historically ingrained in such use. Another important thing, which again might be of particular relevance to the questions about ecosystems that are of interest in this conference, is that considering these different forms of bias and dependencies between them highlights the importance of appreciating that technology does not exist in a vacuum. Instead, it exists in the wider legal, moral, and cultural set of ecosystems, which it can then reflect, mimic, and reinforce, as is increasingly exemplified in the context of AI. And one concern which is only now gaining in prominence relates to whether and how, through reinforcing the biases, technology might actually gain in such prominence that it will determine and entrench the legal and governance structures in our society, and whether and how it might end up contributing to shaping our culture and society in ways that, from our vantage point today, we might perceive as undesirable. So suddenly the suggestions that Netflix are making of what to watch next might not appear so innocent. Okay, so following this general introduction, I would like to move on to the specific types of work and reflections that are emerging from the work within AI itself, focusing mainly on bias. And there, as I said, there has been a lot of work done to understand the specific issues. And this is one particular example from the paper by Suresh and Gutag, who are documenting and elaborating on the different forms of bias that we may find and we need to actually take into account and safeguard against when we design technologies, when we train those technologies, in particular the models, and when we consider how these technologies are actually going to be deployed. Of course, evaluation is also an important aspect. So they're talking about historic biases that I have already talked about. They talk about representation biases, which, as I said, also already relate to under or overrepresentation of certain populations. But they also go down into details of how the specific choices that we make at different points in the design will affect whether or not the systems that we design are biased, and therefore they will also affect the ethical value of the technologies that we design. So they're talking about the choices that we make with respect to how we process the data and how we decide on the ground truths as the basis for the processing of the data. They're talking about aggregation bias, which relates to the assumptions that we make about the consistency or accuracy of our assumptions between the inputs that a system will receive and the labels that we will assign to those inputs in order then to allow the system to enact and to achieve its task. They're also talking about learning bias, which relates specifically to the choices that we may make with respect to how we train and evaluate our models. They talk about evaluation bias, which relates to how we match between the benchmark data which serve to develop the system and the data against which we are evaluating this system. They talk about the deployment bias, which they specifically say relates to the mismatch between, or potential mismatch between task and the context intended, and the real world task and the context within that real world. So all of these biases are really important. The list of those biases is really useful to have in then interrogating how they can enter into the development process. And it's useful because from the design perspective, the design of the technology perspective, it allows us then to develop a set of questions and auditing mechanisms to try to prevent the issues arising later when the technology is already developed and deployed in the real world. Of course, they also provide a set of principles then, or basis for developing a set of very concrete principles to then translate into policies and more kind of overarching governance processes. So this is just to give you an idea. This is from another set of colleagues. This, in fact, has been presented as part of the tutorial at the FATSTAR conference in 2019, where they essentially take the audience through the different stages in the technology development pipeline, specifically focusing on machine learning, because this is obviously a hot topic and also considered as a paradigm where these ethical issues may arise most prominently, owing mainly to the huge dependence of machine learning on data and voluminous data. There are a number of stages which involve quite a lot of, or require quite a lot of thought and reflection, and also sometimes quite hard decisions. I will give you 3 examples in a second, but just before I do that, one thing that these colleagues emphasize is that for a long time, and that was, a source of a lot of problems as well with respect to the ethical value of the systems that have been developed. Work has focused in the bottom part of this cycle. So this essentially relates to the fact that a lot of these systems and AI in general, until quite recently, has been actually mainly the domain of engineers in computer science labs. And so these technologies were often developed as test beds and experiments, really, for the hard questions in computer science and artificial intelligence that these engineers wanted to address. So it has been only recently that the idea that actually there is an outside world in which these technologies might exist and that they may affect is relatively new. It's important to also remember this, and just the sheer fact that it has been highlighted so many times now over the past at least 5 years, 5 to 7 years, actually changed profoundly the way that engineers perceive themselves and the way that they perceive their role. They may not all be proficient ethicists, and maybe we should not expect them to be so, but at least there is actually a culture now of an understanding and a mindset that it's probably a good idea to think about the outside world and to recruit knowledge and know-how from experts who actually are in a habit of connecting with the real world. So just to give you a couple of examples of issues at these different stages, one is the task definition. which is really critical, and it's often kind of taken for granted. You know, this is where the assumptions can really trip us over quite badly from the point of ethics. So this is an example of a facial recognition system which set out to predict criminality, and it's a very infamous example which has been received a lot of criticism, rightly so, and also highlighted how critical it is to actually really stop and think about the purpose that we put in the machine, not only from the point of view of whether a machine is able to achieve that purpose, but also of the broader implications in the moral, historical, legal, ethical way. Another example is of data construction. So we're kind of going from one by one. I'm not going to go through the entire cycle because we don't have the time, and it's hopefully not necessary, because there are a lot of issues that emerge across the different stages that are very similar. But going back to the data set construction, this is an example, already an old example, but quite illustrative, from data being derived from skewed sources, which can then proliferate down the pipeline and affect the quality of the system's decision making and ethical quality as well. In this particular example, this was data which was used to develop a system that allowed residents in Boston to report potholes in a pothole reporting app so that they could be fixed. The problem at that particular point in time was that this app relied on smart technology or smartphones, which were not yet available to everybody. I mean, they're still extremely expensive. And the consequence of this was that actually the reporting happened predominantly in affluent areas of Boston, leaving less affluent areas full of potholes, which highlights how bad decisions with respect to the sources of data that our systems rely on can lead to harms of allocation, which I will talk about in a second, but which essentially relate to lack of access by certain populations to resources and benefits. And in terms of the model definitions, this is an example from a police app or system that has been used in the US, that has been used to estimate the number of arrests in a particular area in order to then deploy appropriate police resources to those areas. But of course, this app has been made on the assumption that the number of arrests within an area is an appropriate proxy for the amount of crime in that area. And again, this is another example of potential they are not potentially, they are historic inequalities which are encoded in data, because typically arrests tend to happen in more deprived, less affluent areas, typically with high racial dominance of particular populations with respect to race as well. I mean, to put it blankly, in America, areas which are inhabited by Black African African Americans. So, it's almost these kinds of assumptions can lead to self-fulfilling prophecies, whereby more police presence leads to more arrests, because obviously there is more vigilance, and so on and so forth. So these are just a couple of examples from this development cycle, which really we need to examine at every stage and very precisely. And if we don't, then we do actually risk quite substantial harms that can be done as a consequence, as I have already started talking about and illustrating. I already mentioned harms of allocations, which relate to the lack of access to opportunities or resources. And these types of harms are kind of related mainly to the economics of our lives. They are quite well documented, and they are documented also from before AI took prominence within our lives, and they have been documented also because they are immediate, readily quantifiable, discrete in nature, and also they are transactional. By contrast, harms of representation, which relate to reinforcement of inequalities between classes or groups of people, have received less attention, because they are actually long-term. They are very difficult to formalize. They are diffused in nature, and also they are culturally ingrained. So again, the understanding what kind of concerns, what kind of issues arise and might be introduced, what kind of biases might be introduced when we are designing technological artifacts, and what kind of harms they can lead to, is critical then to allowing us to stand back and think and rethink indeed how we might approach the way that we think about the technology, the role of technology, and how we design and deploy these technologies. It's therefore quite important to map different AI biases, sources, and harms. And this is something that we have started doing, mainly with my colleague Wayne Holmes. This is a table from a chapter which is going to be published in the Handbook of Artificial Intelligence in Education. It's in print, it's in press, but we don't have the date yet of when it's going to come out. And this table actually takes the different forms of biases as a first step to try to understand how they arise, what forms of biases at those three levels that I have described: moral, legal, and social cultural, and social technical. Where do they arise at these various levels, and also to understand more clearly how what kind of harms they may be leading to. So I'm not going to go into detail of this right this minute. This is just to illustrate that this mapping has taken place. I will return to this table when I expand in a moment on how we then took this and extended this to AI in education context. There are a number of
Kaska,
yes?
Sorry to interrupt, but there is another event that takes place, let's say, 10-15 minutes from now. I wanted to make you aware that unfortunately your talk must be shortened a little.
Okay, I'll do my best to shorten it.
Thank you so much.
Yes, and again, apologies that we started late. I feel terribly bad about this. Okay, so just moving on very quickly, there are a lot of recommendations for best practices. which also come from Kramer, Vaughan, and Holstein, which I won't go into detail here, but they essentially relate to the need to define the purpose very clearly and the task, to examine our assumptions, to examine our sources of data, and to examine whether we can, or to question ourselves whether we can actually introduce some of the measures for or fairness measures and fairness requirements within the actual algorithms that we design. And we need to be ready, if our assumptions don't stand up to scrutiny, to actually refine them and refine them at those various stages, and at times also abandon them, like was the case or should have been the case in the case of the face recognition system for predicting criminality. Addressing these and achieving and fulfilling these best practices is not trivial. This is an example. This is the kind of mapping that René Kijiltes and Hansel Lee have done in a book, which I have co-edited also with Wayne Holmes, which is due to come out in August, who examined different ways in which we can actually introduce fairness metrics and mechanisms into the algorithms. And there are many different ways we can do this. We can do this by making the algorithm blind to certain demographic categories. We can make it make predictions regardless of group membership. We can make the algorithms evaluate itself with respect to counterfactual examples in the specific context. But none of these approaches actually in isolation or even together guarantee that the algorithms are going to be fair and that the systems are going to be of good ethical quality. And there are also a number of barriers for implementing best practices, which range from organizational to deciding who actually sets the priorities, who is the decision maker, and also things that we can introduce, harms that we can introduce by actually trying to correct for biases. So, for example, imposing tax, participation tax on the underrepresented groups, or bucketing values. So, for example, if someone identifies with more than two races, or discarding data, and so on. And there are, I'm sure, many more of the issues that we need to really take really great care to consider. Moving on to now the ethics of artificial intelligence. As I said, this is a lot of the work that I'm talking about is published in this book and in the chapter that I have mentioned that will be published in the Handbook of AI in Education. A lot of the same issues are present across the domains, and indeed they can be identified within the in the context of artificial intelligence in education. But there are specific also specificities which are very ingrained within the fact that actually we're dealing with the context of education. We're dealing with technology that is designed as an intervention to change human behavior ultimately. And so in their chapter in this book by Holstein and Derudi, in their overview of the key issues surrounding the ethics of AI for education, they have identified two overarching levels at which questions about the ethics of AI ed need to be addressed. And the first level is the social technical level, which is the context within which the technology is being deployed and for which it is being designed, including the different stakeholders that can make decisions or that are beneficiaries of these technologies, and also the AI ed interfaces level, where we need to be concerned with a lot of the issues which I have already discussed at the AI algorithms and data levels. And so if we start actually trying to understand, when we start mapping between these general universal principles of AI and more specific research that has been done already to understand how different biases become manifest within the technology at different stages of design, deployment, and use, we can then start understanding better what is it that we are looking at and what we need to take account of within the context of AI in education. So in this context, there are actually particular issues which relate to the questions around the equity of access. So for example, does everyone has access to equally good technology? This is a persistent problem within AI in education and ed tech research, because persistently, even in very well-developed countries, a lot of children, a lot of schools in a lot of areas still do not have access to good enough technology. So when we're designing our technology, we need to be very aware of that, and we need to account for the fact that what we consider an ideal kind of solution to give to educational context, it may actually not be accessible by everybody. Another issue relates to equity of accessibility. This is something that is becoming very well documented within the context of AI in education and educational technologies. So, for example, is the content equally accessible? And examples of inaccessibility of context include curricula which are really not taking account of the cultural specifics of the students who are supposed to engage with those curricula. I mean, very prominent example would be of Ukrainian children who are now, a lot of whom are in schools across Europe, who basically have to accommodate for the differences between their culture and the culture of their country, of the countries, host countries. Another issue relates to the equity of pedagogies. So again, this is to do with whether the technologies are actually focusing on a range of pedagogies which are suitable for a range of students. There is actually a dominance within AI in education to focus on particular forms of pedagogies as low-hanging fruits, such as drill and practice, mastery learning. And there are also questions around human versus machine autonomy that is facilitated within, or that is accounted for within the technological designs, which need to take into account the level of control that we give to the users, also as a means to potentially reinforcement or confirmation bias. So an example of this might be from learning analytics, which might make particular suggestions to teachers about their students, which on the one hand may serve to actually spotlight issues that the teacher might not have actually have taken account of, but on the other hand, it can reinforce wrong or unhelpful kind of decision making on the part of the teacher. I won't spend too much time on this because I have already talked a lot about the issues of algorithmic and data bias. So we talked about representational biases and measurement biases and predictor biases. And I also have highlighted the issues with the algorithmic fairness. With respect to the algorithmic fairness, one thing that it really, I mean, this applies to all different AI applications, but is of particular concern within education. We do need to consider what kind of fairness dimensions we are responding to, whether we are trying to provide for the equality of processes or outcomes, for example. Are we targeting individuals, or are we targeting groups? And unfortunately, these different considerations and decisions that we make with respect to them may not be compatible. So this raises questions around, how do we communicate this to the users? How do we make this transparent? Because transparent, we do need to make it, because if we cannot really be fair to everybody at all times through our technologies, then this needs to be highlighted as an issue from the very beginning. And then finally, there are issues related to the methods used to generate the data. And one thing that I would like to highlight at this point relates to the ways that we collect the data within educational contexts, how we process and analyze the data, but also the focus on how we, and that relates also to the representational biases, how do we sample the data? There is a notorious lack of representation of schools and children and learners from rural areas, for example. There is also a segregation between mainstream learners, and I'm here talking mainly about K-12, and neurodiverse learners. So there are a lot of considerations that we need to take into account, and which will impact on the applicability of our systems, and again on the on their ethical value. And so, just to finish, I'll be very quick. We have taken all of these different documents, if you like, of the biases, the sources, the harms, and we have also examined in detail the different perspectives within the AI in education research to understand what kind of questions we need to ask ourselves as designers and developers of these systems for education, as a first step of actually furnishing the field with some concrete principles for ethical or ethically good practices. So again, I don't have time, obviously, to go into these, unfortunately. We have produced a very detailed analysis in terms of the problems that we may face in the context of education. And we have divided this between the data lens, the algorithmic or models lens, the lens of the pedagogies that are encoded in the systems, and also the kind of consequences and the impact at the socio-technical level. So we went through patiently through all of the different forms of biases by Sresh and Gutag, and produced a set of questions for the developers as a first step for self-auditing of the designs by the designers. Just to say that actually by analyzing these different forms of biases in the educational context, we have also identified further specific biases that are specific to education, one of which is domain value bias, whereby certain domains are given a higher status, if you like, over other domains within the not just within the educational AI in education development, but also within education. So STEM subjects, for example, over design subjects. And so these typically are underserved through the technologies that are being developed. And another one is the learning culture, bias, which relates to the kinds of pedagogies that are being served over others. So I mentioned mastery learning, which is the dominant one, in fact, and it's also one which reinforces through the use of technology the dominance within the system itself. So performance 2 exams, for example, and particular forms of assessment, which may not be conducive to all forms of learning. We know that they are not conducive to all forms of learning for all learners in all contexts. And so just to wrap up very quickly, we do need to consider all of these questions at multiple different levels. And we need to be, we need to extend our ecosystems in order to be able to then interrogate what we do within the AI Ed and within broader technology design for education in a more informed way, so that perhaps we can also rethink the way that we are actually developing these technologies. And we do need to take into account that there are multiple different and potentially conflicting interests that come to play when it comes to the decisions that are made, not only at the design level, but also at what kind of technologies are being deployed in real context, which technologies are being promoted by policymakers, for example, and businesses, and so on, and how the whole field sits within the broader socio-economic context, and how it affects that context in return. So we do have to, this is really final, we do have to really think very carefully about the field. We also have to consider that the field of AI is not a monolithic domain in itself. So we can bring to bear many different domains, and we should. It is a multifaceted field which has specific instantiations, affordances, and challenges in the specific context of its application. It is first and foremost a design science, which can act as a form of philosophy, where we can ask really fundamental questions about learning and cognition, the role and nature of education and society. It is also a methodology for investigating those questions. And it is also, importantly, a field of civil engineering, where we are developing tools to help to address particular problems which relate to the teaching and learning in particular. What is really important here is that with all this knowledge and know-how, we are in a position now not only to map and to understand the concerns, the ethical concerns in the context of education, but we're also in a position to understand that a lot of the fairness and equity dimensions within the AI Ed are necessary dimensions, but they are not they are not sufficient in themselves. We need to really stand back, and we need to think about what we know about the ethics and what we know about the difficulties that we are facing in tinkering with the current standard models on the basis of which these technologies are being developed, can be changed to provide for a greater transparency about what each system does, what pedagogies, for example, it caters for, what training data and test data has been used to develop these systems, what biases it may harbor, because it will harbor biases, and so on and so forth, to provide the users with a much more agency in selecting the appropriate technologies. We need these systems to be also able to explain the system's operations and inferences. That's actually a really hard question to address, because there are a lot of intricacies and nuances that we need to also understand with respect to what would make sense to what kind of users. And we really do need to consider very carefully the questions of autonomy within these systems, and the questions of who and when and why and for what purposes has control over the operation of the system. And just a final quote from Norbert Wiener, which goes back to the point of the importance of considering what purpose we put in our machines. This quote is as relevant today as it was back in 1960, when he said, "If we use to achieve our purposes a mechanical agency with whose operation we cannot interfere once we have started it, because the action is so fast and irrevocable that we have not the data to intervene before the action is complete, then we had better be quite sure that the purpose put into the machine is the purpose which we really desire, and not merely a colorful imitation of it." Thank you.